Good morning, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks again for joining us today. So I believe I've spoken to many of you before, but my name is Henry Coles. I manage the airline distribution standards team that is based across Geneva and Montreal, and I'm here in Geneva with Jojo. I'm just doing another quick sound check. There might be a problem with the audio. Just if someone can just please type into the question box if you can hear me okay, that would be great. Perfect. Okay, thank you, everyone. So as Jojo mentioned, the purpose of the webinar today is really focused on the campaign activity we have. But more generally, it's also really important that everyone is very clear on the governance structures that IATA has around standard setting, because standards is such a core function of what we do. So really just encouraging everyone to make the most of this presentation. If you have any questions, we have some time at the end of the webinar where we can run through that. And really just important to ensure that everyone is completely comfortable with this material and that you're able to discuss this with all our airline members. So what we're going to do today is we're going to run through just a recap of the background around the changes we have to the governance structure. You will have seen a lot of this material before, but just a refresh. We'll talk briefly about what the campaign is all about, what the activity is, and how this complements the other touch points we have with airlines. And then finally, we'll just look at some of the tools you have available to answer questions. So first of all, to recap on the background of the changes, many of you will have seen this picture before. IATA's governance revolves around two very separate pillars. On one side, we have the industry committees. These committees advise IATA on policy and programs, and they report directly into the IATA Director General. So they're relatively closed groups. They're groups of senior delegates from airlines that are appointed onto the committee, and they represent the industry to provide advice to IATA. On the other side of the page, we have the traffic conferences. The role of the traffic conferences is to develop and adopt industry standards. And industry standards are ways we have of all doing things the same way. And because standards generally bind member airlines, the structure on how they're developed is very different. So the traffic conferences are always open to every member. They report directly to the general meeting, which is every member airline represented in one forum. And they all operate under a single structure, which is the provisions of the traffic conferences. And this sets up a structure where every member airline has just one vote, regardless of the size of the airline. And generally, all the groups that operate under the traffic conferences are always open to member airlines. It's a very transparent and open process. So the changes we have to governance that are happening this year relate to just two of these conferences. So they relate to the passenger services and the passenger tariffs conference. And it's really important to note that we have no changes as part of this initiative to any of the other conferences. So no change to the passenger agency conference, no change to the cargo conferences, and also no change to the industry committees. So many of you will again be familiar with the structure we have to develop and adopt passenger standards today, and it's a little bit messy. We have the two different conferences, the services and the tariff conference, together with the interline billing and settlement operations general meeting that develops interline billing standards. So it's a very messy structure, and there are a number of challenges we have with the structure. It's very inefficient because we operate these two separate conferences, despite the fact that both of them are sort of looking at passenger distribution standards. We have a lot of different groups reporting directly to the conference. It's often very confusing for airlines to work out which group does what and how they participate. And we also have a lot of technical experts within the working groups, but we don't really have any groups that provide us with direction or strategy. And it's often very difficult to align what we're trying to do in different business domains because we have so many groups and we have technical experts rather than decision makers. Finally, the structure we have today, a lot of the processes we use are fairly slow. We structure a lot of our activity around an annual face-to-face conference cycle. We rely very heavily on paper agendas and face-to-face meetings to do voting. And so as we try to improve the way we set standards and speed things up and increase agility, we need to have a structure that better supports these improvements in process. So with all those points in mind, we embarked on an activity in 2016, both internally within IATA, but also engaging with some key airline stakeholders around how we could redesign the structure. And essentially what we have tried to do is to move away from groups that are structured around processes and move towards groups that are structured around business domains. And this means that we can better align what is happening with today's standards with what is happening with our transformation programs, things like NDC and One Order. And it also means that we can future-proof the structure, because if something comes along down the track where there's benefit in industry activity, we have a clear home within the structure for that conversation to occur, rather than having to create yet another group that we simply tack onto the structure. So what this then led to was the drafting of a new resolution, which is Resolution 009, and this was adopted unanimously by the airlines at the Passenger Services Conference and the Passenger Tariffs Conference in 2017. And this resolution takes effect from the 1st of November this year. And what the resolution does is it creates a new structure for the development and adoption of passenger standards. And this involves some really important changes to the structure we have today. And we're going to run through this in a little bit more detail over the next couple of slides. So the most important change is that we merge the activity of the Passenger Tariffs Conference and the Passenger Services Conference into a single structure. So while the Passenger Services Conference and Passenger Tariffs Conference continues to exist according to the provisions, from a practical perspective, we manage this as one single structure. We communicate to airlines on the basis of a single structure, and we align all the activities so that everything is happening together. So that's the most important change. The second most important change is that we get rid of all the technical groups that report directly to the conference, and we create just 5 permanent groups that report to the new combined conference. And these groups are the management boards. And so they're not technical working groups building and developing standards. They're management boards providing oversight across business domains. And these boards are then able to create and disband groups to keep things relevant and to speed up our activity. So just to recap there, the structure now has 3 very separate layers, 3 types of groups with 3 very separate functions. So we have the conference and its steering group, we have the management boards, and then we have the groups under each management board. And we're going to look at those in just a minute. So the conference itself continues to operate very similarly to the way the Passenger Services Conference and the Passenger Tariffs Conference operates today, except that it's now combined into a single activity. So under the provisions, we still have a structure where every airline has just 1 vote. We still have the structure where to adopt resolutions we require unanimous support from all airlines. But we have a little bit more transparency and flexibility around what the conference is able to do in terms of delegating authority for other standards. So for standards that are not quite a resolution or a recommended practice, the conference is able to delegate the authority down to the management boards. And this might be things like data exchange standards, implementation guides, best practices, and other sort of secondary layer standards. And this allows us to do things with much more agility because the management boards are able to do this themselves. The conference also changes slightly in that it now has a very clear role to elect and oversee the management boards. So the combined conference will continue to meet face-to-face once a year. The key change really is the combination of activity. So the services and tariff conference activities are combined into a single structure, a single meeting, and airlines are able to accredit a single representative across all the conference activity. We then have the steering group. And the steering group, the role of the steering group is really just to steer the overall activity of the groups and within the conference structure between the meetings, and also to discuss any sort of cross-functional issues that cross over the different domains of the management boards. And there's a slight change to how the steering group functions, in that it will now be a very structured group comprising the chair and vice chair of the conference and the chair and vice chair of each management board. So it's a closed composition of 12 delegates with a very enforced structure representing all the different management boards. So then we get to the management boards themselves. So we have 5 separate domains. Each domain has a management board overseeing strategy and direction across the domain. We have the plan board that looks at anything around scheduling, interline, network, minimum connecting times, anything around planning or setting up airline activity. We have the shop order board that oversees any of the sort of commercial or passenger distribution processes we have at industry level. So anything from pricing, reservations and ticketing in today's world, but also things like offer and order management under the NDC in One Order program and our intermodal standards. We have the travel board, which oversees any sort of process that occurs at the airport or in flight, things like baggage, DCS, passenger experience, common use. And then we have the pay account board that oversees any of the processes supporting back office or financial functions, things like BSP sales reporting, fraud, customer payment. Finally, we have the Architecture and Technology Strategy Board, and this board is a little bit different because it's not actually overseeing a business domain, it's overseeing the consistency of data exchange standards. It's ensuring that we have a consistent approach to industry messaging. It's looking at the industry strategy around messaging technology and information technology generally, and it's managing utilities such as the airline industry data model. So in a way, the Architecture and Technology Strategy Board, it's a little bit like the IT department of the standard setting framework. The business boards own the business decisions, and the Architecture and Technology Strategy Board ensures that where there is data exchange involved, that this is happening in a consistent and interoperable way. So how will the boards work? The boards are comprised of a maximum of 18 airlines, and the intention is that these are senior decision makers within airlines. They're not technical experts, they're management representatives from the airlines that are able to really speak to the airlines' requirements around the direction of industry standards right across the domain, and to speak to things like prioritization, implementation roadmaps, and cost-benefit decisions. So this is really a sort of new layer in our standard setting framework, and it's one that we have to focus on very, very carefully to ensure we get the right people into these groups. So the key functions of the board, beyond these discussions around direction and strategy, they have the autonomy to create and disband working groups as they need to ensure that the standards within their domain are developed. And they can do this entirely on their own. They don't need the authority from the conference to do this, and that is one of their key functions. So then we get to the groups under the board, and this is where things start to look a lot more familiar, because we're looking at technical groups that are developing specific areas of standards, and that's very much the way that things work today with all the groups we have under the conference. So we have these groups that are relatively open. We're looking to have a core membership in each of these groups of organisations committing to the activity, but the groups are generally open, and any airline or strategic partner that has an interest in the activity is welcome to participate. And the function of these groups is to develop standards in specific areas. So really the only key change we have with the new structure is that these groups will not be permanent. They're created by the board, but they're only ever created for a 12-month period. And at the end of that 12-month period, the board either disbands the group or they can re-endorse them for another 12-month period. And that ensures that the groups we have under the structure, we're always critically looking at them. We're ensuring that we only have groups where there's a clear requirement to have them. And it also really focuses the activity of the group. So that's a brief recap on the background of the changes. We're now going to just have a bit of a look at what the campaign is all about and what we're asking from the IATA teams and the actions for our member airlines. So before we jump into the campaign itself, just a bit of a run through on what airlines have already received. So there's been a number of different touch points with airlines already on this topic. First and foremost, a lot of airlines are very familiar with this because it's outlined in the resolution that was adopted last year at the conference. So this has now been sort of visible to the industry for 12 or 18 months, and airlines unanimously adopted this resolution last year at the Passenger Services Conference in October, and then by mail vote with the Passenger Tariffs Conference. So there should be a broad level of familiarity. If we sort of fast forward to this year, we had the first transmittal of this year's PSC agenda that went out on the 16th of August, and this again ran through the changes that will be effective from the 1st of November. We had the call of nominations for the new management boards that went out with that agenda, and we also had all the materials around the initial setup of groups under the boards. So we worked very closely with a small group of airlines over the last 12 months, which was our governance transition committee, and we developed a whole set of terms of reference for new groups under each board to ensure that we could really hit the ground running and have some of these groups in place from the 1st of November. So all of those terms of reference went out with the PSC agenda on the 16th of August, and at the Passenger Services Conference in October, all airlines will have the opportunity to endorse that first setup of groups, and then it's entirely up to each board to manage this moving forward. So immediately following the PSC agenda, we had the letter that went out from our Director General to every airline CEO. I have to sort of pause here and apologise because we weren't quite expecting this one to go out as early as it did. So we were hoping to synchronise this a little bit better and have the regional campaign launched before this letter went out. Unfortunately, the DG's office was extremely efficient and that went out just slightly earlier. So I do apologise there for that that slight hiccup. But in any event, that letter did go out on the 17th of August. It ran through for the airline CEO what the changes were and who their current accredited representatives were. We then had a letter that went out directly from the secretary of the conferences directly to the accredited representatives and all the alternates, and that went out on the 24th of August. And again, that just reinforced the fact that the changes were coming and advised that the nominations for the board positions were open. We then had an email blast that went out to every existing participant of every group under the existing conference structures, and that was sent separately by each IATA secretary of each group, and that went out, it's actually last week. So that has now gone out. As Jojo mentioned earlier, we also had a sort of public webinar for airlines that happened on the 5th of September. So that was 2 days ago. And the invites for those webinars had been included in all the existing materials that have been sent out for airlines. So we had about 20 or 30 airlines on one webinar in the morning and another 20 or 30 airlines on another webinar in the afternoon on the 5th of September. And we'll share the list of participants on that webinar when we send the materials out from today's session. We've also had a lot of engagement with strategic partners, and that's happened through the strategic partner team in Montreal, and we'll have some further communications there coming out very shortly. So I guess the obvious question here is, if we've talked to so many different people from airlines in so many different ways, why are we still running a campaign? And really what we want to reinforce today is that we really need the help of all the local teams to really make sure that we're getting all the benefits of this new structure. So first and foremost, this is around simple human touch. It's around making sure that because these changes are so fundamental, that airlines are actually having some human contact. So we can blast out messages to the CEOs, we can blast out letters, we can blast out communications, but it's really just about making sure that for our key kind of members in every region, that we're having a phone call from the regional office, and for our smaller airlines that may not always be involved in these activities, that they've got a human being that they can talk to and ask questions. So that's really the most important point. Secondly, we also know that the teams in the local offices have much closer contact with a lot of our airlines than the teams in the centre do. And you have a much better knowledge of who in the airlines should be engaged in these communications. So we're really encouraging everyone in the local teams to not be limited in who they're sending this information to. If you have contact points in airlines, please just send this information out to them and have the conversation. We kind of have a problem in all our standard setting activity that we tend to end up getting the same people at airlines that are always involved, and the reality is there's a whole lot of really switched on people within our member airlines that should be involved in this activity, and they're just not. So if you have contacts specifically within those areas that are impacted by our industry standards, and I've listed a few there, it's things like schedules, interline, revenue management and pricing, sales and distribution, anything that happens in the airport, passenger experience, baggage, but also things like finance, interline billing, sales reporting. If you have any of these contacts, please just blast these materials out to them and make sure they're aware of the changes and they're aware of who they should be talking to internally. So that's a really important reason why we're running the campaign. Thirdly, as I mentioned earlier, the management boards are quite a different kind of group, and it's not something that we've had before in our standard setting framework. So again, we're really relying on the local contacts to have these discussions with our member airlines and ensure that they are nominating senior managers onto these management boards. So I'd really encourage you to sort of identify the 2 or 3 key airlines in your region or in your market, and just have a really proactive conversation with them about the management boards. It's a really great opportunity for every airline to contribute to industry standard setting activity at a more senior level, and there's huge benefits for airlines to do this. It gives them the opportunity to talk to their counterparts within other airlines within the same domain. It gives them an opportunity to engage directly with strategic partners, people like the GDSs and other suppliers at a senior level, and it really gives them an opportunity to drive the direction and strategy of industry standards. So we will be working closely with Jojo and with the regional TMP managers to keep you updated on the board nominations we're receiving, and we might directly ask for your help if we are aware we're not receiving nominations from key airlines or we're not receiving adequate nominations from specific regions. So that's kind of an important point. And then just very finally, it's very important that everyone in IATA is familiar with these changes and that they're familiar with the structure we have to set standards. So we're relying on everyone that's on the webinar today just to keep spreading the word internally as well. If you can share this internally with your teams, we will be sort of ramping up some of the posts we have on the intranet over the next 2 or 3 weeks as we head out to the conferences. But it's really important that anyone that's talking to external teams is really familiar with the setup so that they can ask questions or point people in the right direction. So in terms of what we're asking the airlines to do, This has been a very consistent call to action in all the touch points that we've had to date, and we'd really just like you to sort of reinforce this with airlines also. 3 key actions. So first and foremost, there's an opportunity for the airline to update their accredited representative. So now that we have the 2 conferences being combined as a single activity, it's a great opportunity for airlines to accredit just 1 person across both conference activities. But they need to actively do this. It won't happen automatically. So if airlines take no action, it means that they will have a separate PSC representative and a separate PTC representative. And that means that when the conference activity occurs together as one meeting next year, that both those representatives would need to attend to vote. And that's very inefficient. So we're really encouraging airlines to take the opportunity to simply accredit 1 person across both activities. There's a web form now to do this. It's very, very simple. And the only real requirement is that we still have the authorization from the CEO for the accredited representative. And we can do that now with a scanned copy of a signed letter, or even just attaching an email trail with the CEO's authorization. So we've simplified the process, but we still have that requirement under the provisions. So that's the first action point. The second action point is around the management boards. So just encouraging every airline to consider nominating for one or all of the boards, and to ensure that they have a senior management delegate that they are nominating. Again, there is an online form to do this. It's very, very simple, and there's a little bit of a urgency on that one because the nominations are only open until the 20th of September for this year. And then we will obviously have another cycle next year, but for the board nominations this year, 20th of September. The third action point is a little bit more of a thinking ahead action point, and this is to encourage every airline to really start planning around their participation in all the groups under the boards. So a lot of airlines will already have existing people in some of the technical working groups, and they may continue to participate in the new groups, but it's a great opportunity now that we have a much clearer structure and a clearer idea of which groups sit where, that every airline is just having a bit of a look at the structure and working out where they'd like to be involved. We will have some further communications that come out directly to airlines in November. So as soon as we have the endorsement from the conference of the new setup, which occurs in October, we will have this blast out of communications in November, just confirming all the groups and confirming to airlines how they become involved. So great opportunity now for airlines to have that thought process and to get ready for that, that will be coming. So what happens next? Once again, nominations for the management boards open until the 20th of September. So we've really only got a couple of weeks. The second transmittal of the PS tender will go out on the 20th, and that will have the names and details of all the nominations for the management boards. The management boards will be elected by the Passenger Services Conference in October, and then this will be endorsed by the existing Passenger Tariffs Conference by mail vote. So the initial setup of groups will also be endorsed by the Services Conference and confirmed by the Tariffs Conference. And so from the 1st of November, we will have our management boards with all the confirmed participants, and we will have our initial setup of groups all ready to go. And as soon as we have that in place, we will then communicate back out to all airlines. Just a final point is that it's a really good opportunity also just to encourage every member airline to participate in the Passenger Services Conference. So the Passenger Services Conference, it's occurring in Rome on the 22nd of October. It's just one day this year, and it's the day immediately before the Airline Industry Retailing Symposium. So for any airline that registers to attend the PSC and comes along, they're entitled to attend the first day of the industry retailing symposium free of charge. So it's a really great selling point, and I'd encourage everyone to talking to airlines about this. We'd obviously also love them to stay and attend the full symposium also, and there's a discounted rate for those attending the PSC to be able to sign up to the retail symposium. If you haven't already, jump on that website and have a look at the agenda for the retail symposium, because it's a really powerful agenda. There's some great topics around sort of the future of distribution, talking about really live examples of NDC implementation, dynamic pricing, future of interline. There's a whole lot of really interesting topics and some great speakers as well, CEOs from GDSs, from airlines, new entrants, startups. It's a packed agenda. So please make sure you're giving that event a plug with the airlines as well, but also encouraging them to come along to the services conference the day before. It's not a huge agenda for the PSC this year in terms of other standards. We've got the usual kind of changes to the various resolutions, but most importantly, because we'll be electing those management boards and endorsing all those new groups, it's a great opportunity for the airlines to come along. So just in the last sort of 5 or 10 minutes before we open the floor for questions, just running through the tools you have available. We did pull together a fairly comprehensive brochure that just sort of runs through these changes and runs through the actions that airlines need to take. This is a really good one just to blast out to anyone at airlines that you have. So you can grab that directly off IATA.org at any time. The URL's there. It's then available in a PDF. It's just kind of 4 A4 pages, so it's very straightforward. So please, if you do nothing else, blast that out to any contacts you have at airlines. There's a whole lot of information also available on IATA.org on a specific page around the Passenger Standards Conference itself. This will continue to be the kind of landing page for this activity. So as we get the groups endorsed and the boards in place, we will put all that information up there. So feel free to bookmark that page as a kind of reference point moving forward. You're most welcome to contact our team or myself directly at any time. So we're here in Geneva and Montreal. If you don't know who we are, sing out and I can introduce you. We also had a video that we produced for airlines and also for the regional teams. We'll ensure that URL is included in the follow-up to the session. And finally, if you can't get in touch with anyone directly, always feel free to shoot a note through to that shared inbox. That's managed by our team, so we can always make sure that queries to that inbox get routed through to the most relevant person. So that's available also. So perhaps just before we go to questions, just reinforcing again, standards is a really core activity to what we do in IATA. Please make sure you're very comfortable with all this material and that you're talking about this with airlines. These changes, they're actually a really kind of significant step in what we're trying to do across IATA to make our activity more accessible, to make it more agile, more relevant across all our members. So we really appreciate all your help. Your engagement in this activity is absolutely critical. And once again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. So that kind of brings us to the end of the materials. We've got a number of questions that have already come in on the webinar, so I can start running through those. And in the meantime, do please feel free to submit any questions you have directly into the webinar also. So the first question is around the board nominations and whether that's appointed by name, like the industry committees, and this is a really important one. So it's not actually appointed by individual, it's appointed by airline. So this is really important. So we have a maximum of 18 airlines for the board, and if the airline is nominating themselves, they're actually nominating themselves as an airline, not as an individual. But what we do ask each airline to do is to indicate who the individual is that will be representing them for the 2-year term. So we expect that if that named delegate is included in their nomination, that individual would be the person that represents the airline for the 2 years. But we do acknowledge that things sometimes change, people move on, people retire, people leave organizations. So if the named delegate does leave in the middle of their term, the airline is able to provide a new delegate to continue serving the term. But from a pure governance perspective, it's at an airline level, not an individual level. The next question we have is the qualifications for the members. We've made a little bit of a recommendation in terms of the qualifications for board members, and that's outlined in the brochure. Really, the only key piece is that the board member has a decision-making authority over some or all of the domain of the board. So they need to have some sort of financial authority to make decisions in that area. Beyond that, we can't be too prescriptive. So we've made some suggestions around likely titles that we think might be applicable under each of the boards, and that's outlined in the PDF. But the key thing is really just the decision-making authority, and that allows the board to really make qualified conclusions and decisions around things like which areas we're prioritizing, how quickly we're able to implement. And that's a really key change to the structure, because at the moment we have a lot of technical groups comprised of technical experts, and they do a great job at building standards and developing these technical solutions, but often they're not the people that sign checks or actually make the decisions on behalf of the airline to implement things. And that leads us to develop a whole lot of standards which never get implemented, and that's what we're trying to address with the boards. There is a question around a chart describing which working group is in which board. Absolutely. The tricky thing with this is that until the Passenger Services Conference adopts the setups of working groups, we don't actually have an official version of this. So we have a proposed setup of these groups, which goes through to the conference in October. And so this is kind of now in place. It has been included in the Passenger Services Conference agenda from the 16th of August. What I can suggest is we can probably include that as a PDF, and we can get that sent out with these materials also. And I'll just put a big disclaimer on it to say it still needs to go through the conference. There's a question here around the terms of reference for each group. That is a similar answer to the answer for the question before. The terms of reference have all been drafted, and they're all in the proposal that goes to the conference. So if you haven't already, I'd really encourage you just to have a quick look at that first transmittal of the PSC agenda. All the terms of references are included in that agenda. As soon as they're endorsed by the PSC, we will post them up individually on the page on IATA.org, just so there's full transparency. We have another question that around whether there's one person that can represent an airline at both services and tariffs. It's a really good question. The key thing is that if you look at the scope of the services conference today, it's actually huge. And we already have a situation where there's one person that has to represent their airline across that whole gambit. So the services conference today looks at everything from reservations all the way through to baggage, anything that happens in an airport, but also anything that happens in ticketing and distribution. It's really, really huge. And so just kind of adding the tariff resolutions into that scope is not actually a big deal, because the scope's already so broad. And so the key thing for that one person that's voting on behalf of their airline is just that they're engaged internally. It needs to be someone that sits in a team that's sufficiently connected to a lot of different passenger teams, or that is sufficiently senior to have that kind of liaison. So we acknowledge that there really isn't one person that represents every team across every passenger process. It's more just around the internal internal engagement. And many airlines do that very, very well today. You'll find that they have their PSC representative that engages with all those departments. They turn up to the conference absolutely prepared to speak to their airline's position, and that's what we're looking for. We have another question around the regional breakdown of the boards. The way the resolution is drafted, there is no prescribed breakdown for the board members. So we had a lot of discussion around this with airlines and internally. The decision was made to leave this open at this point in time. But what we are doing is we are going to work very closely with the regions to make sure that we have adequate nominations from each regional area. So we'll be doing that over the next week or so. We're slowly starting to see nominations come in now. So we'll be sharing the nominations on a weekly basis, both with Jojo and with all the regional TMP managers. And other regional contacts, and we would like to ensure that we're getting some strong nominations from all regional areas. Another question on the board nominations and the approval from the PSC PTC reps. So we do ask that the board nomination is approved by the rep, and this just kind of keeps everything very lined up and clean and ensures that the airline isn't nominating two different people for one board, that there's one person in the airline that has oversight of it. The question is, what happens if the airline doesn't have a PSC or PTC rep? And I guess my answer to this question is it's a great opportunity to make sure they do have a rep. So if they don't have a rep, I would strongly suggest you push back on that airline and just get them to name one person as the rep. And that could be one of the board nominations. It's really just a focal point in the airline so that there's one contact. If they don't have a rep, it would need to be the CEO approving this. So it's really good opportunity for the CEO to make one approval, accredit a representative across both conferences, and sign off on the board nominations. Next question is, what is the process if there are more than 18 nominations for any board? And that would be a simple election on the floor of the conference in October. So if we have 18 or fewer nominations, the conference simply endorses the 18 members and the board is immediately created. If we have 19 or more, we have an election on the floor of the conference, and every airline has one vote for each board, and the 18 airlines with the most votes are elected. Another question on if we share this presentation, we certainly will. So we'll share this as a PDF. We also can share the PDF of the external webinar we ran with airlines, because that's something you can share that doesn't kind of talk about the IATA bits and pieces. And the brochure itself is a really good resource to share with airlines also. There was a question that came through from Laura also on whether we will run another external webinar. We absolutely can. It's not a problem. We hadn't kind of scheduled anything, but if you're getting feedback from airlines that suggests we should run another one, we can absolutely get this in the diary over the next week or so and just blast the invite out. So that's entirely up to you. We can do this kind of regionally, we can do it by time zone, whatever you like. So I think that brings us to the end of the questions in the webinar. So if anyone was sitting on a question, now is your chance to type this in. If you'd like to send questions through directly by email, that's fine also, and I can do it one-on-one.
I don't see anybody typing. So I will be sharing the recording of this webcast and the last one as well, together with the Q&A. And I will check with Henry when is the best time to have another external web call. Okay. So again, if you have further questions after this call, feel free to contact your TNP manager or directly to Henry or myself. So thank you so much to everybody, and have a good weekend. Have a good day to all.
Thanks, everyone.